Hi everybody. This video is about gender and translation. So Greek is a gendered language. That means that certain words like nouns and adjectives have a grammatical gender. English is not gendered in the way that Greek is, and so if we're used to English or another non-gendered language, then there are some interesting things to consider in Greek that we might not be accustomed to. Some of you, I'm sure, know other languages that are gendered, and so some of this may be old news for you, but I think it's worth talking about in reference to Greek in particular and to define some of the best practices in how to deal with gender in our course. So as we are learning, as we get into nouns, Greek has three grammatical genders: the feminine, the masculine, and the neuter. And the grammatical gender of a word does not necessarily correlate with maleness or femaleness of the thing it refers to. Often it does, but it doesn't always. So for example, the word arche is a feminine noun for ruler, yet a ruler in ancient times is almost always going to be male. And so the feminineness of the word does not imply the feminineness of the referent of the word. Logos means word. That's a masculine noun, but there's nothing intrinsically male about a word. That's not implied at all by the fact that it's a masculine noun. And then soma, body, is a neuter noun, but the body is probably the place that we can most fully speak of maleness and femaleness occurring. So the fact that the word is neuter does not imply that the body is somehow ungendered. So all this to just show grammatical gender and the gender of the actual referent don't necessarily line up all the time. Now in some cases, a masculine or feminine pronoun in Greek should be translated with the neuter it instead. So in Matthew 5:15, for example, it says oude, kaiusin, luchnan, kai tetheasin, altan, hupa, tan, madion. So altan there is a masculine pronoun. Usually it would be translated him, but it's referring to the lamp. So usually people say no one lights a lamp and sets it under a basket, though if you were being super literal, you'd probably want to say no one lights a lamp and sets him under a basket. But this sounds very strange in English, and that's not how we translate it. So in this case, the grammatical gender is masculine, but the pronoun is conventionally translated it. In some other cases, it's ambiguous whether he or she, a gendered version of the pronoun, or it should be the appropriate translation. So at the beginning of the Gospel of John, it says en arche, ein halagos, and then in verse 3, panta di altu, agenita. So in the beginning was the Word. The Word is a masculine noun we just mentioned. And then later it says panta di altu, agenita. All things came into being through him or it. It's the masculine pronoun referring back to logos. So very, very literally it would be him. However, this is really grammatically the same thing we just saw with lamp, where we said it. But in this particular case, Christians are usually pretty familiar with this passage. We know that the logos, the word, refers to Jesus Christ, who's male, and so usually we translate, all things came to being through him, even though grammatically this is the same as the example we just used. So I'm not saying we shouldn't say him. I'm just saying appreciate that there's some ambiguity. There's a stylistic decision being made there. And that again just hammers home that grammatical gender, the gender of the translation, the gender of the referent, these don't perfectly correlate. Now, another interesting issue is related to the masculine plural form of nouns. So as with most gendered languages, Greek uses masculine plural for a group of men and women. So if we're using the word brother, adelphos, the masculine singular form brother is adelphos. Technically a different word, but kind of the feminine analog of adelphos is adelphe, so that would be sister in the feminine singular. The masculine plural form is brothers, adelphoi. And then if you want to refer to a group of sisters, you would use adelphai, the feminine plural form. And then if you want to refer to a group of brothers and sisters, you say adelphoi, which is the masculine plural. So as you may have noticed, brothers and brothers and sisters have the same form of the Greek noun. And so this presents an interesting issue. For example, when Paul often addresses his adelphoi when he's writing letters, and you see this in 1 John, and I think you'll see this some in the Gospels as well. If we stick to the grammatical gender and say brothers, that in a sense can sound closer to the Greek. In my video about misconceptions about Greek, I mentioned this a little bit, that being closer to the Greek is not always being closer to the intended meaning, so we want to be careful about that. But in this case, if we choose to translate the masculine plural with an English masculine plural, that probably sounds like it's talking about just a group of men, whereas a lot of times in Paul's letters it's clear he's referring to a group of people that includes men and women. Oftentimes he addresses specific women by name, and so we want to see this as adelphoi in the sense of brothers and sisters, a group of siblings. So again, being accurate to the grammatical gender does not mean being accurate to the meaning of the text, and in some cases that can be powerful. Sometimes people feel included or excluded based on which of these two translations you choose. So this is an important thing to keep in mind. Now, in some cases, it is grammatically ambiguous whether a masculine plural represents a group of men or a group of men and women in a particular text. So in the Septuagint version of Joshua 2:13, it says, "Zogresete ton oikon tu patrosmu, kai tein metera mu, kai tus adelphusmu." And so tus adelphusmu is the masculine plural. And so you could translate this, "Spare the house of my father and my mother and my brothers," or you could say, "Spare the house of my father and my mother and my brothers and sisters." And the difference is going to be whether you think that the siblings involved are all male or male and female. Or in this case, you could sort of defer that decision and say, "The house of my father and my mother and my siblings," so you can kind of get yourself off the hook on that one. But the point is, and it's not that this is a particularly important decision in this case, but the point is sometimes it's ambiguous. We actually, in this, I don't think there's anything in the passage or in the whole text of Joshua that makes the decision for us. And so someone just has to make a choice one way or the other if they're translating. And so it's important to recognize sometimes that's just what a translator does. Now, another interesting thing to keep in mind with gender and translation is the word anthropos, which we've probably seen already at this point. Anthropos can mean, if you give a particular, I'm quoting a particular set of definitions here. It can mean man, it can mean mankind, it can mean person, it can mean people, humankind, human being, and various things like that. So anthropology, the study of humanity, comes from anthropos. Now, in past generations, it was considered acceptable to refer to humanity as man or mankind, the history of man, stuff like that. In humanities fields today, and in Fuller Seminary's policy, it is no longer acceptable to use man or mankind to refer to humanity in general. And I think increasingly that sounds exclusively male in our culture. And so, so anthropos does not emphasize maleness, and for this reason it's preferable to say human or person. Earlier, if you look at something from the 1950s, it might say man, and it's understood that that includes men and women, but that's just not how the language is being used anymore, at least in certain areas. So the Fuller policy and my policy is if you see anthropos, you should use human or person or something like this because it's not a specifically male term. The one exception I would use for that is the phrase son of man, which of course we're all familiar with. Because we're accustomed to that phrase, I think it's reasonable to say son of man. So that could be the one exception where I'm fine with a sort of male-sounding interpretation there. At the same time, the Common English Bible uses the human one instead, and if you want to go that route and try to really pursue gender inclusivity, even in that case, that's fine with me too, but I'm okay with either choice on that one. And it's worth noting Greek does have a word specifically for man that is gender specific, and that's aner, which can be man or husband, and then gune would be the feminine word that corresponds to that, woman or wife. So aner, if you see that, should be translated in a way that implies maleness. So man rather than person or human. It may not be obvious, but the word androcentric and other andro words come from aner. Some translations render ambiguous masculine plurals as masculine. This would include the ESV and the NASB. And then some translations use inclusive language, such as the NRSV and the Common English Bible, the CEB. So, for example, if we're looking at Galatians 1:2, it says, Hoi sun emoi pantes adelphoi. And adelphoi here is the masculine plural for brothers that we talked about. So the ESV says, all the brothers who are with me. It goes with the masculine translation because the ESV advertises itself as closer to the Greek. It's sticking with the grammatical gender. The Common English Bible says, all the brothers and sisters with me, which is also, it's just as close to the Greek actually. It's taking it as a brothers and sisters thing, which I think is perfectly reasonable. The NRSV gets a little more creative and says, all the members of God's family who are with me. So it's kind of trying to capture not only the inclusiveness, but also the metaphorical significance of what's being said. And for our purposes, if you find yourself in a situation where you have to make a translation decision like this, I would say the CEB type version, brothers and sisters, is fine. I'd prefer if you stayed off what the NRSV is doing here. Try to stick close enough to the language that I know that you understand what you're reading, that you didn't just grab it from some translation that you happen to look at or something like that. So I would say something like brothers and sisters would be more appropriate in whatever other example we might think of that's analogous to this. Do be gender inclusive when you're talking about a group that potentially includes both men and women, but still try to stay sufficiently close to the grammar that it's clear to me that you're translating the grammar. Now, translations that are closer to the Greek grammar are not necessarily closer to the Greek meaning. This is kind of what we've been seeing already. So, the policy when we are speaking of people in a context where men and women could potentially be included, Fuller's policy is to use inclusive language like brothers and sisters. And so I'll go with that as well. I want you to be inclusive when you're talking about a group that could include men and women. Potentially doesn't mean that, so if Paul's writing a letter to the Galatians, I guess I'm not sure if there's anything in Galatians that clearly, explicitly shows that he's talking about men and women, but potentially we'd probably want to say, yeah, that probably is what's going on. So I would say that's an appropriate situation to use brothers and sisters. If we're talking about Joseph and his brothers in Genesis, it's fairly clear it's talking about a group specifically of brothers most of the time. So in that case, I would say brothers is justified. Now, some of you may have already anticipated this, but there's also the question of what to do with divine pronouns. And so in scholarly theological circles and things like that, you may have heard people use gender-neutral ways of referring to God, like saying God's self instead of him. Fuller's policy on this permits masculine pronouns for God, though it does say we want to use inclusive language when a group of men and women potentially is involved. God, it is legitimate at Fuller to say he and things like that. I'll accept either. So if you would prefer to, if you're translating theos or something like that, or using a pronoun that refers back to God, you can choose to say him or whatever, himself, or whatever the case may be. If you'd prefer to keep it gender neutral and say God, God's self, stuff like that, I'll accept that as well. I want to honor, I want to give you as much liberty within Fuller's policies as I can, so I'll accept either answer there. So for example, if we're looking at, going the wrong way. If we look at Psalm 2:4, it says, ha katoikon en uranois ek gelasatai. All of these translations are acceptable based on what I'm telling you. You can say, he who sits in the heavens laughs. That's the ha, masculine singular. He who sits in the heavens laughs. You could say, the one who sits in the heavens laughs. If you wanted to capitalize that because it's talking about God and you want to show reverence, you could say the one, capital, who sits in the heavens laughs. Or you could say God who sits in the heavens laughs. And so the last three are gender neutral. The first one is masculine. I will accept all of these answers in a situation like this. Okay? Great.